Wilfred Faraday had barely transferred to our school when he started dating every pretty girl in sight. The haughty prom queen, the aloof class beauty, the cute girl next door. Eventually, perhaps bored with the lack of challenge, he set his sights on me. I was the complete opposite of all the girls he dated before. Bookworm, goody-two-shoes, top student, dimwit, oddball. These were the labels he'd given me. Later, he cornered me against a wall and said, "Winifred Tennyson, I truly love you." I looked up at him coldly and asked, "So what?" Wilfred Faraday became instantly popular when he transferred to our school, thanks to his handsome looks and impressive family background. Even our headmaster, the head of this prestigious secondary school, would greet him with a polite smile and ask, "Wilfred, how is your father's health these days?" Everyone fawned over him, but I was the only one who remained indifferent. When Wilfred first started pursuing me, someone warned me, "Good heavens, Winifred. That's Wilfred Faraday we're talking about. Don't play too hard to get." I didn't understand. In everyone's eyes, he was Wilfred Faraday, capable of achieving anything he desired effortlessly. No one could resist his charm. It was as if he were royalty, and his attention was akin to receiving the monarch's favor. So, I was expected to blush and stammer at his advances, feeling honored by his interest, and eventually fall into his arms to become his girlfriend. And then, inevitably, become one of his many ex-girlfriends. Yes, ex-girlfriends. Wilfred was known as the school's notorious playboy, unabashedly flirting his way through the student body. In the 2 months since his transfer, he had dated nearly every pretty girl in school. The haughty beauty queen, the cool class president, the sweet girl next door. His promiscuity matched his charm in equal measure. Eventually, bored with the lack of challenge, someone jokingly said to him, "If you could win over Winifred Tennyson, now that would be impressive." He lazily raised an eyebrow and scoffed, "How hard could that be?" And so began his pursuit of me. How do I know all this? Because I was sitting right in front of them, solving practice problems. I was a legend at school, an academic legend. Since entering 6th form, my total score had never dropped below 680 points, no matter how difficult the exams were. I consistently ranked first in every test, big or small, leaving the second-place student far behind. Apart from studying, I showed little interest in anything else, which is why they made that joke to Wilfred. I couldn't fathom their logic and found it all rather tedious. But Wilfred took it as a genuine challenge and began pursuing me. It started with imported snacks left in my desk, then various flowers, water-soaked daisies, budding roses, delicate water lilies, discreetly placed on the windowsill next to my desk. Others saw it as romantic. Then came elaborate breakfasts and occasional understated but clearly expensive gifts. This was probably his usual strategy for wooing girls. I ignored it all, and he continued this nonchalant pursuit for a month without me saying a word to him. Our first conversation occurred one afternoon when he approached me with a textbook, pointing to a bonus question and asking for help with the solution. I'm always willing to help anyone with academic matters. As I was explaining the problem-solving approach on a piece of scrap paper, he sat beside me and suddenly asked, "What do you like?" I put down my pen and looked at him coldly and seriously. "If your mind isn't on studying, don't waste my time." He suddenly laughed, then glanced at the scrap paper before saying, "The answer is root 3. I understand now. So, what do you like? I ignored him. After that, I began experiencing inexplicable bullying. Black scribbles on my seat, missing chairs and books, being locked in the toilets, childish and crude acts of school violence. When Wilfred found me, he appeared like a savior, rescuing the bullied girl. He unlocked the toilet door, then looked at my soaked clothes with a frown, taking off his jacket and offering it to me while asking, "Who did this?" As if he was going to stand up for me and right this wrong. I looked up at him coldly, not taking his jacket, and merely glanced at the time before saying emotionlessly, "You've made me miss 15 minutes of physics." He raised an eyebrow and asked, "How is that my fault?" Seeing his attitude, I finally lost my patience. I looked at him and stated matter-of-factly, 1. I'm kind and keep a low profile. I've never offended anyone. 2. Before you announced you were pursuing me, no one ever bullied me. 3. If it wasn't on your orders, who would dare bully the girl Wilfred Faraday is chasing? The pretense of concern finally vanished from his face, replaced by a sort of amused smirk. He withdrew his jacket and looked at me with interest, laughing, "Oh my, you've figured it out." I coldly turned away, walking past him without a word. As we brushed shoulders, he grabbed my wrist, forcing me to stop. He tilted his head, looking me up and down, and asked, "Winifred Tennyson, are you playing hard to get?" This question made me laugh. I stopped, turned to look at him, and sneered, "Then why don't you just be patient and stop bothering me? Wait until my true colors show, and you'll know whether I'm playing hard to get or not." He held my wrist, his gaze fixed intently on my face. After a moment, he suddenly smiled. He said, "Interesting. I don't love Wilfred Faraday. However, it seems no one believes me. How could anyone not love Wilfred Faraday? He's so excellent, handsome, intelligent, and charming." My indifference appears to trouble him greatly. I often catch him looking at me thoughtfully, as if trying to figure me out. He's like a hunter waiting for manna from heaven, patiently setting his trap. He became my desk mate. At first, our classmates were all in a state of watching the show, even setting up a betting pool. I remained unmoved, studying my lessons, solving my problems, memorizing my books. He sat beside me like a ghost. Later, everyone seemed to assume we were a couple. The maths teacher especially liked to call us to the blackboard together to solve problems. Every time our names were called, the class would erupt in knowing cheers, while he would turn his head in the midst of the commotion, looking at me intently with a slight smile. A look that seemed full of deep affection. My former desk mate said I was as unromantic as a stone. She said, "Come on, Winifred, that's Wilfred Faraday. I know he's a player, but who wouldn't want to date him? It doesn't have to lead to marriage, but at least you'll have had the experience." I expressionlessly spread her barely passing physics test paper in front of her and said, "First, let's focus on improving your physics grades. You got wrong answers on problems we've gone over before." She wailed and huffed, "Winifred, you blockhead, you dunce." Poor Wilfred. I don't understand what's so pitiful about Wilfred Faraday. His interest in me is just a passing whim, nothing to do with true feelings, only about conquest. My relationship with Wilfred Faraday slightly improved when my mum accidentally fell and fractured her bone, landing her in hospital. I took a week off from school. When Wilfred found me, I was selling fish at Borough Market. The neighbors all knew about my family's situation, so my fish sold out as soon as I set up my stall. A neighbor auntie carrying a bag of cod sighed and said, "Winifred, come by later to pick up some soup I'll make for you to take to your mom at the hospital. The A-levels are coming up soon, you should focus on your studies." I smiled, "Thank you, auntie. Don't worry, I won't fall behind in my schoolwork." Then I started cleaning up the mess on the ground water tanks, cutting boards, fish scales everywhere. As I was stacking the boxes, I looked up and saw Wilfred Faraday. He was standing at the entrance to Borough Market, his demeanor completely at odds with the noisy environment filled with the smell of various seafood and meats. I don't know how long he had been standing there, just quietly gazing at me. I ignored him. As I was struggling to load the boxes onto the electric tricycle, he walked over, his expensive shoes stepping in the muddy ground, and took the fishy-smelling box from my hands, steadily placing it in the back of the tricycle. He said, "This kind of work should be done by someone with more strength." I didn't stand on ceremony and quietly watched as he helped me load the boxes without minding the dirt. Then he sat on the tricycle seat, somehow making the electric tricycle look like a Porsche supercar. He turned his head to look at me and said, "Come on, where's your house? I'll take you." I paused, standing still, and asked flatly, "Do you know how to ride it?" He hesitated, a bewildered expression slowly spreading across his handsome face, probably stumped for the first time, looking so helpless. I couldn't help but smile slightly and said, "Get off." He looked at me, and for some reason also smiled, his tone wistful. He said, "Winifred Tennyson, this is the first time I've seen you smile." Later that week, he came punctually every day to help me set up and pack up my stall. The first time he saw me swiftly killing a fish, he just stood there grinning to himself for no apparent reason. I looked at him quizzically, and he said with a smile, "I just remembered a meme. I don't know if you've heard it, I've been killing fish at Tesco for 10 years, my heart has become as cold as the knife in my hand." I thought it was just a joke, but now I see it's become reality. He asked me, half jokingly, half seriously, "What about you, Winifred Tennyson? Is your heart as cold as the knife in your hand? I smiled at him, responding frankly to his probing. Wilfred Faraday, we're from two different worlds. As you can see, I'm not playing hard to get. I don't have time, I don't want to, and I can't afford to play your games. Don't waste your effort on me. My gaze was honest. He looked at me intently, his smile gradually fading, before finally smiling again. He turned his head away, and I couldn't see his expression, only hearing him say, I understand. I finally breathed a sigh of relief. Wilfred Faraday started dating again. Beautiful, charismatic, proud, he still changed girlfriends quickly. He remained my desk mate, but finally stopped bothering me, and gradually people stopped associating us together. I actually doubted whether Wilfred truly understood what it meant to like someone. His feelings seemed to change as swiftly as clouds in the sky. Sometimes I would witness him skipping class to buy tea for a girl one day, only to coldly break up with her the next. Occasionally, I'd encounter tearful girls trying to win him back. His tone would be gentle, his expression smiling, but beneath it all lay a detached coldness tinged with impatience as he'd say, "Didn't you know what kind of person I was before we got together? Let's part ways amicably, don't cling on." As I worked on my exercises, watching his ruthless, unmoved demeanor, I said sincerely, "Wilfred, you're truly a scoundrel." He leaned back in his chair, arms spread wide. "I'm transparently a scoundrel, openly flirtatious. That's far better than those two-faced rogues who cheat and swindle." He smiled at me. "Besides, as long as you don't date me, I'm a good person." That was the truth. I lowered my head and returned to my work, ignoring him. Our first time drinking was after the A-levels. The class organized a farewell party, and everyone's emotions were mixed. Influenced by the atmosphere, I also sipped some beer. Later, he walked me home. The moonlight was like water, and he followed silently behind me. He was unusually quiet that day. When I looked back, I found him walking with his head down, each step landing on my shadow. Amused, I asked, "What are you doing?" He looked up, gazing at me matter-of-factly, and asked, "Desk mate, which university do you want to go to?" I turned my head away, and he continued, "You know, even if you don't tell me, I can find out. I just want to hear it from you." I sighed and said, "University of Edinburgh." He nodded, standing there smiling at me. Suddenly, I understood why, despite his open flirtatiousness, so many girls were willing to briefly possess him. Looks aside, his appearance was truly stunning. Especially now, standing in the moonlight with that smile elegant, poised, like a young gentleman, his smile as bright as the moon embracing the night. He smiled genuinely, different from the perfunctory, lazy, careless smiles I often saw on his face. Perhaps it was the gentle moonlight that made his expression and tone so tender. He looked at me softly, his voice low, then, "Desk mate, see you at Edinburgh." I didn't speak, just quietly looked at him. Finally, I replied, "Goodbye." I thought we probably wouldn't meet again. I received his call before the results were announced. I wasn't surprised at all that he had learned of my admission results in advance. He must have been furious, laughing in anger, coldly repeating 3 times over the phone, "Winifred Tennyson, well done." I held the phone without making a sound, until rapid beeps came from the other end. Later, when the admission results were released, the school celebrated with red banners announcing my first-place admission to the University of Chester. On the banner below, I saw Wilfred Faraday's name. He was going to the University of Edinburgh. The University of Edinburgh and the University of Chester are actually in the same university town, separated by just 2 roads. But I thought, given Wilfred's pride and arrogance, he probably would never contact me again. We were from 2 different worlds to begin with, and even in the same university town. I thought that unless we deliberately sought each other out, we probably wouldn't meet again in this lifetime. And indeed, that's how it turned out. I went to my new school and became a new legend there. From the balcony of my dormitory, I could even see the oak trees of the University of Edinburgh, but until my 3rd year, I never encountered Wilfred. I only occasionally heard his name, mixed in with various rumors and legends. But I think he probably heard about me too. We met again in the 2nd semester of our 3rd year. That year, by coincidence, I went to Chester for a teaching program, but unexpectedly, an earthquake struck. It happened in the middle of the night, just after I had finished preparing for class and was reading a research report. When the dormitory building collapsed, I quickly hid in the triangular corner of the wall, which formed a small space where my body wasn't crushed by steel bars and bricks. I was dug out about 2 or 3 days later. I was very weak at the time, but I remained calm. The rescue team held up fingers in front of me, asking how many, while others brought water and cheered. Then I saw Wilfred at the back. Silent, red-eyed, intently gazing at me, holding tools, his clothes tattered, his face covered in dust and blood, a completely disheveled Wilfred. I don't know how he knew I was teaching in Chester, but the truth was laid bare before me the moment I was rescued. He knew I was in Chester, so he came. No matter how our relationship turns out in the future, whenever I think of this moment, I believe that at least he truly loved me once. We hadn't seen each other for 3 years. That night, as I was receiving in 4 of saline, he sat by my bedside. His features had matured a lot compared to 3 years ago, and he seemed even more taciturn. The curve of his jaw was smooth and resolute as he watched the saline drip down from the 4 bag. His expression was self-mocking, his tone seemingly puzzled as he said, "Winifred, you looked quite surprised when you saw me." He smiled. Actually, I was surprised myself. When I heard about the earthquake in Chester, I didn't think, I just came. For these 3 years, I've been following your news and updates. It's strange, I can't even figure it out myself, what exactly my feelings for you are. Is it an obsession born from never having obtained you, or is it because I truly like you? I have no reference, but in my world, you seem to be an exception in yourself. I interrupted him, saying, since we don't know the answer, let's verify it then. I looked at him calmly. He seemed slightly dazed at my words, as if he didn't understand what I was saying or thought he was hearing things. I smiled at him and said, let's verify it, Wilfred. Will you be my boyfriend? He looked dumbfounded, like an idiot, but after a moment, he turned his head and said, are you pitying me? He pretended to be indifferent and sneered, I've had so many girlfriends, don't think that I calmly interrupted him, I'm not heartless, Wilfred. I haven't been there, done that, so my heart isn't cold enough yet. No one would be unmoved in this situation. I paused, smiled, and continued, but if you keep talking, I might really change my mind. He was silent for a moment, swallowing the rest of his words, then said fiercely, well, you better be sure about this. Verifying means that I'm your only correct answer, and once you've submitted, there's no turning back. I looked at him with a smile and calmly said, but Wilfred, before we get together, we need to set some ground rules. Wilfred and I had a sweet time together once. Like a fairy tale, the beginning is always twisty, and the ending is always sweet, but Wilfred and I weren't living in a fairy tale. After the sweetness, the inevitable mess began to appear. I don't remember when the arguments started, but at first, it was just about small things. For example, he accepted handmade gifts from other girls, played games with junior girls from the same department, and sent tipsy female friends home. He never understood why I was angry about these things. I didn't cheat, I don't love them at all. Winifred, what exactly are you angry about? I could only look at him in silence. His conditions were too good, rich, talented, handsome, with a good family background. So there were always people flocking to him like fish crossing a river. He wandered among the flowers, seemingly ambiguous but untouched. After we got together, he started to settle down and behave himself, but obviously, our understanding of settling down and loyalty didn't seem to be the same standard. He might not have had other intentions, but I always received messages from unknown sources, taunting me about when I would step down. After arguing about this kind of thing many times, in the end, I didn't want to speak up anymore. I broke up with Wilfred because on his birthday, I brought a handmade birthday cake to his university to find him. When I called him at the school gate, he hesitated and asked, "Didn't you say you were busy with biological research and had no time?" I smiled, holding the cake. "Didn't you say I never give you surprises?" After hanging up the phone, he rushed back from off campus, probably celebrating with a group of friends off campus. When he saw me, his eyes lit up, and he walked towards me quickly with a smile. As he bent down to take the cake from my hand, I noticed a lipstick mark on the collar of his white shirt. And there was a small bite mark on his neck. I calmly switched my phone to selfie mode, aimed at that bite mark, took a photo, then held it up in front of him and asked him what it was. He was rarely flustered, and later he kept apologizing and explaining to me, saying it was a dare from a classmate and it didn't mean anything. That bite mark was when he rejected that girl, and she pounced on him and bit him when he wasn't prepared. He really hadn't done anything to betray me. I'm a person with stable emotions, always calm, but that day was probably the first time I lost my composure. I smashed the cake in my hand onto him. I looked at him coldly, sighed wearily, and said, "The verification is complete, Wilfred." From the first step, we calculated the procedure wrong. In fact, from the moment we wrote down that solution, we could have guessed that every step after that was wrong. I sighed in his shocked gaze and said, "We really aren't suitable for each other. Let's break up." Then I turned and left. Afterwards, Wilfred kept apologizing humbly. He had always been arrogant, and that was probably the first time in his life he had lowered his head to someone. He said, "Winifred, that really doesn't mean anything. You know that for me, you'll always be the exception." I sighed. Later, when he came over once, I was having dinner with a senior from my undergraduate days who had once pursued me but was politely rejected and returned to being just friends. Wilfred knew this senior had pursued me, and his face suddenly changed when he saw us, becoming gloomy and displeased. You see, this person's standards were so double. In the midst of his anger, I calmly asked, "Wilfred, according to your logic, I'm just having a meal with a senior who once pursued me. What could that possibly represent?" He said, "Winifred, you're just taking advantage of the fact that I like you." I sighed. That's not how you love someone. I've always been calm, probably because I understood Wilfred too well, so a breakup as an outcome was within my expectations. Wilfred once called me when he was drunk and asked, "Winifred, sometimes I really doubt if you ever truly loved me. Why can your emotions always be so stable?" Wilfred never agreed to break up, right up until I was preparing to go abroad for further studies. Before I left for abroad, he condescended to chase me to the airport, standing at the departure gate, asking me in a cold tone, "Winifred, you really want to break up, don't you?" I said I would change, I would stay away from all women, I would restrain myself according to your standards of loyalty. "Won't you turn back?" I sighed and said, "Yes." He looked at me for a long time, and finally, coldly, with a tone of suppressed anger, said, "Fine, don't regret it." My answer to him was to turn around and board the plane without any lingering attachment. That was probably the first time Wilfred had been at a disadvantage with a woman. He never lacked people around him, always at ease among the flowers, and this was probably the first time he had been broken up with, hurting his self-esteem like this. So even though we had so many mutual friends, whenever I appeared in a chat, he was always silent. This wasn't his usual manner. Later, there was a terrorist attack in the district where I was staying abroad. I don't know how Wilfred knew which district I lived in, but on the night of the riot, I received a call from him asking, "Are you all right?" I said, "I'm fine." Realizing my tone was cold, I added, "Don't worry, the embassy has already issued a rescue notice." He made a sound of acknowledgement and hung up, then appeared in front of me the next day, travel-worn. He just looked at me from afar, as if to confirm that I was indeed all right, then left without saying a word. At first, the friends around me tried to persuade me, saying, "Winifred, I really don't understand you. Wilfred is so devoted and rich, why don't you want him?" In their eyes, a playboy like Wilfred was indifferent and absent-minded to everyone else. It was all just playing along, and I was the most unique and different one. After I went abroad, someone still told me, "Winifred, it's really strange. You see how flirtatious and affectionate Wilfred is, but it seems that only with you, we can be sure that no matter when you turn around, he's always within your reach." I smiled without speaking, perhaps only I knew clearly in my heart that even if we had another chance, the outcome between Wilfred and me would still be the same. I'm the kind of person who always treats feelings as black and white, 1 is 1, 2 is 2. I don't allow any gray areas to appear. I want the person I love to be faithful, with their heart and eyes full of only me. Wilfred is inherently unrestrained and loves freedom, with so many temptations around him. He can change for me for a while, but if he has to face only me for a long time, forever, when he no longer feels fresh, no longer willing to compromise and accommodate for love. Returning home was 3 years in the making. Before my return, I chatted with an old friend who sighed and told me that Wilfred Faraday had found a girlfriend. She added that the girl bore some resemblance to me, but quickly clarified, of course, she's not as pretty or elegant as you. At that moment, I found myself staring at a cluster of roses in a vase on a nearby table, lost in thought. After a while, I came back to my senses and smiled. After all these years, he hasn't changed. My friend chuckled and said, "That girl looks so much like you. We all know young Mr. Faraday isn't serious about her." I could hear the disdain in her voice for the girl. I remained silent for a moment, then changed the subject, chatting idly for a few more minutes before hanging up. I didn't dwell on the matter. That was until I returned home and my friends threw a welcome back party for me. It was at this party that I met Wilfred Faraday and his stand-in that my friends had mentioned. I'm not sure if Wilfred intentionally brought her to meet me, but he stood before me, holding the girl's hand, and introduced her, Winifred Tennyson. "This is Megan Sinclair, my girlfriend." He emphasized the word girlfriend and watched for my reaction. Out of curiosity to see how Megan resembled me, I observed her for a moment. Upon closer inspection, our facial features weren't that similar, but there was a 5 or 6 out of 10 similarity in the contours of our eyes and brows. Coupled with our similar clothing style and hairstyle, that 5 or 6 out of 10 similarity became more like 7 or 8. I shifted my gaze and gave Wilfred and Megan a faint smile, saying, "Hello." Megan stared at me, lost in thought, before coming back to herself. She smiled weakly and said, "Hello, I've heard so much about you." I sighed inwardly, realizing that in the eyes of Wilfred's past girlfriends, I probably represented the unattainable ideal, the one who wins without even trying. This imagined affection, exaggerated through speculation and conjecture, had turned me into the hypothetical rival for all of Wilfred's subsequent girlfriends. I didn't engage with the implication in her words, instead turning to greet other friends. I'm not sure if my prolonged gaze at Megan gave Wilfred the wrong impression that I cared. But afterwards, as if deliberately putting on a show for me, Wilfred treated the girl with extreme tenderness and consideration. He pulled out her chair, poured her drinks, and even, noticing Megan's pale complexion, felt her forehead with his hand and asked concernedly, "Are you cold?" He took off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. The friends around us fell silent, quietly shifting their gaze from him to my face. I smiled warmly at Megan and asked, "If you're still cold, shall we ask the waiter to turn up the temperature?" She silently shook her head. Later, my favorite spicy prawns were served. Friends laughed. "Oh, who told the kitchen to make the blue lobster spicy? What a waste." They all knowingly looked at Wilfred. He didn't look up, just started peeling the prawns. In the past when we were together, he always peeled prawns for me. Everyone used to say it was the young Mr. Faraday condescending. This time, after peeling, he put them in Megan's bowl beside him, saying gently, "Eat up." Megan looked up at me, then turned to look at Wilfred, and silently ate. Wilfred kept peeling for Megan. She ate as many as he peeled. I didn't touch a single prawn from that plate. Later, the initial tenderness on Wilfred's face had turned to indifference. He placed the last prawn in Megan's bowl with a blank expression and asked, "Do you want more? You seem to like prawns so much, shall I ask the kitchen to bring another plate?" Megan's voice suddenly choked up, and she said quietly, "I've never liked spicy food, nor do I eat prawns." Everyone fell silent, the atmosphere awkward. I stood up with a cold face and said, "I'm stepping out for a moment." As I emerged from the ladies' room, Wilfred Faraday was waiting outside. He was leaning against the marble-tiled wall, exuding an air of elegance in his simple white shirt and jeans. Just as I remembered him. Hearing the sound, he turned his head to look at me, his gaze cold and his mouth turned down. He asked, "Winifred Tennyson, are you feeling proud of yourself?" I gave him a puzzled expression. His tone was calm, as if he was trying to suppress his emotions. "Seeing me find someone who looks so much like you, seeing that even though we've been broken up for 5 years I still can't forget you, are you feeling proud?" I suddenly felt it was pointless. He probably wouldn't believe that if I had known tonight would turn out like this, I wouldn't have come at all. I sighed. "You always trample on others' sincere feelings." "I'm not proud, Wilfred. If you don't like Theodora Sheffield, don't mistreat her, and don't mistreat yourself. If you do like her, treat her well." "Treat her well?" He suddenly laughed, self-mockingly. "When you're not around, I delude myself by looking for your shadow in Theodora Sheffield. But today, when you two sat together, I realized she doesn't look like you at all. How could I insult you by using her as your substitute? Wilfred, my gaze moved from Theodora Sheffield behind him to his face. It seemed we had been out for a while, and Theodora had come looking for us. She had overheard Wilfred's last few sentences. She staggered back 2 steps, reaching out to steady herself against the nearby wall. I saw her eyes suddenly turn red, staring blankly at Wilfred's back. My emotions had been stable and cold until now, but I couldn't help feeling a bit angry. After all this time, you still haven't learned how to respect others. I finished speaking without looking at him, brushing past him and Theodora Sheffield behind him. I walked into the private room, said goodbye to my friends, grabbed my bag, and left. The next day, I received a call from Wilfred. He wasn't angry that I had embarrassed him. Instead, he humbly apologized on the other end, saying he shouldn't have used Theodora Sheffield to test me and put me in an awkward position. He laughed. Winifred, let me treat you to a meal as an apology? He still didn't understand. I hadn't felt awkward at all. I was just angry that after all this time, he still hadn't learned to respect others. He clearly didn't understand liking and loving, yet he kept trampling on them over and over again. I told him I was busy, then hung up the phone expressionlessly. I met Theodora Sheffield a week after that phone call. My assistant told me there was a girl outside looking for me, then gossiped, "Miss Tennyson, she looks quite similar to you. Do you have a sister? How come I've never heard you mention her?" I put down the slide under the microscope and thought for a moment before deciding to go out and see her. To be honest, I didn't have much of an impression of Theodora Sheffield, nor did I have any interest in dealing with her. I could even guess why she had come to find me. It was undoubtedly about Wilfred. I went out to see Theodora because I remembered her pale face and red-rimmed eyes in the hallway that day, and the obvious heartbreak in her eyes as she looked at Wilfred's back. I convinced myself it was just an act of kindness. When Theodora saw me come out, she immediately stood up from the bench, looking a bit nervous. There were obvious tears in her eyes, but thank goodness, she didn't rush over to hug me and cry. She just stood there and said softly, "Miss Tennyson, I'm sorry to bother you. I didn't want to come find you." The tears she had been holding back fell silently, and she looked like a lost lamb, sad and helpless. I just... Wilfred suddenly wanted to break up with me. I know he's always loved you. I came just to ask, have you two gotten back together? I shook my head and said, no. She breathed a sigh of relief and quickly smiled through her tears, saying hurriedly, I'm sorry. Then she looked at me carefully, her eyes full of envy. I really envy you. Wilfred loves you so much. I would give everything to have Wilfred love me like that. Everyone longs for him, but it seems only you can disregard him. I chuckled and asked her in response, you think Wilfred loves me very much? I looked at the marble floor behind her and smiled, he probably does love me, but not as much as you imagine. I paused and asked her, is this why you came to find me? She hesitated, then said, no. She told me that Wilfred's love for me was genuine, that when she first met him, he was calling out my name in a drunken stupor. She said he often stared at her face intently, lost in thought, mentioned the tattoo on his wrist, how he would often stare at a foreign phone number but never dared to dial it, and spoke of his devotion and loyalty to me. Finally, with tears in her eyes, she said, Miss Tennyson, I don't know what misunderstanding you have with him, but Wilfred truly loves you very much. I've never seen him love someone like this. Although he was with me, I know he was just seeing you through me. No matter what misunderstanding you have, I hope you can give him another chance. I looked quietly into her tear-filled eyes and asked coldly, do you feel very noble coming to tell me all this today? Her tearful expression froze, seemingly not expecting me to be so cold. But I was genuinely curious, so I asked, do you and Wilfred really understand how to love someone? You all say Wilfred loves me, but how does he love me? Is it by not being faithful when we were together, or by finding a substitute after we broke up and calling it undying love? And you like Wilfred, but you degrade yourself for that affection, imitating someone else's traits, lowering yourself to dust. Now you come to me saying these things, begging me to give Wilfred another chance. I want to ask, in what position and capacity are you saying these words to me? She looked at me blankly, and I said, my time is very precious, Miss Sheffield. I was willing to spend an hour patiently listening to your nonsense today just to settle this once and for all. Wilfred and I are in the past, and I have never been the obstacle between you two. Learn to love yourself first, then love others. That's my final advice to you. I turned around. This was the last time I saw Theodora Sheffield. The last time I received a call from Wilfred Faraday was before my wedding. A perfect match, they said. Compatible values, gentle manners, and mutual support, we were the envy of many. Wilfred congratulated me from the other end of the line. I graciously replied with a simple thank you. After a moment of silence, he asked, "I've always wanted to know, Winifred. When you agreed to be with me back then, was it just a moment of emotion, or did you ever truly have feelings for me?" I sighed, realizing how often I seemed to sigh because of him. I'm a person with clear goals, Wilfred. I never waste time on things without a future, nor would I agree to be with someone out of mere emotion. I understood you so well. Even before we got together, I knew we weren't on the same path. But at that time, I still wanted to see how far we could go together. Don't ask me if I liked you or not. Attempting the impossible was my greatest respect for you. How could I say I never felt anything? When he jokingly helped me carry water bottles without minding the dirt, when he gazed at me tenderly under the moonlight, when he appeared like a godsend as I was pulled from the rubble. But he could never learn to be faithful, and I was always too clear-headed. So this path was destined to end halfway. Our relationship was like a bonus question I knew had a flawed premise, yet I still tried to find a correct answer within that flawed context. I gave it my all, so I could let go with grace. His voice grew quieter on the other end. I missed my chance, didn't I? I remained silent. His voice regained a hint of forced cheerfulness as he said, "Well, one last thing then. I wish you happiness, Winifred. I wish you happiness year after year." I smiled and replied politely, but distantly, "The same to you. Wilfred, I also wish you happiness, year after year."